started. And I want to kind of do a quick recap on some of the things we were talking about when we left on Thursday. And one thing we were discussing, we were talking about the loan estimate and the closing disclosure. How many days after loan application does the lender have to get the loan estimate to the borrower? How many days after loan application do they have to get to that loan estimate to the borrower? And I'm seeing fingers and they're coming in the chat. You guys are right. So within 3 days of loan application, the lender is to send the borrower the loan estimate and that know before you owe booklet, kind of guiding the buyer through the home buying process. How many days prior to settlement does the lender have to send the closing disclosure? How many days prior to settlement? And that again is 3 days. Thank you, TRID, for both of those being 3 days. So when it comes to TRID, I think when our days, if we can remember 3, we're off to a good start. So one thing we did last week was we looked at our sample loan estimate on page 535. So if you will, turn with me to page 535. We can quickly review. And we talked about within 3 days of loan application, the borrower gets this loan estimate. So on 535, we see things like the loan amount, interest rate, whether or not it's been locked in already. Is there a prepayment penalty, a balloon payment? There's your estimated total monthly payment of $1,050. Now it's estimated because, I mean, at this point, we probably know taxes, but we probably don't know homeowners insurance yet because the borrower hasn't had a chance to shop around for homeowners insurance and decide on who they want to use. So that's why they call this an estimate. So we're just going to estimate $1,050 for your monthly payment. And then at the very bottom of 535, we have estimated cash to close. How much does the buyer need to bring? In this case, it's $16,054. So now fast forward with me and let's flip in your book ahead a few pages. And now let's look at page 540. And 540 gives us our sample closing disclosure. We didn't get a chance to look at this the other day. So I do want to look at this and compare it to the loan estimate. This happens to be the same borrower, the same loan amount. So you could compare and contrast the two. So the loan estimate is within 3 days of loan application. The closing disclosure comes out within 3 days of settlement. Welcome. So again, there's our borrower's information, property information. Loan amount's the same, interest rate, monthly principal and interest. The estimated total monthly payment has come up 26 cents. It was $1,050. Now it's $1,050.26. I don't think anybody's going to get too excited over 26 cents. If this was a big adjustment, much more, then the lender would definitely need to communicate that with the borrower. But then look at the cash to close of the closing disclosure. Your buyer was told they had to bring $16,054 at the loan estimate. Now here we are in the closing disclosure, and your buyer only has to bring $14,147.26. Isn't that good news? Is the buyer okay with that? You were told 16 something, but now you only got to bring 14 something. Anytime those kinds of numbers come down, this is good. What the consumer protection, what TRID is trying to prevent is those numbers going up. And that's where the lender needs to be careful on the estimate that they give. So now your buyer's got a couple $1,000 for, you know what, moving expenses, want to paint a room, you know, whatever they want to do after closing. So that's good news. Maybe, sure. Always the what ifs. We could spend all night on the what ifs, couldn't we? Page 541, again, just a breakdown of those numbers. We're not going to get into a lot of detail just yet. 542, continuing on with these numbers. The math that we're getting ready to do, I call a mini settlement statement. What we're looking at 541 and 542 is a full-blown settlement statement. Good news, bad news. You don't have to do one of these yet. However, when you get to post-licensing, you get to do a full-blown settlement statement. So what you're seeing at 541 and 542, I hand you a blank CD for your test and let you fill in all the blanks. Doesn't that sound like fun? So you don't have to worry about this now, but when you get into post-licensing, you're going to spend more time. Page 542, part of the closing disclosure that I really like, what I think is the most helpful is at the top there. The closing disclosure actually gives the borrower a side-by-side comparison. Here's what you were told at the loan estimate. This is what you're told on the closing disclosure. And did that amount change? Yes or no? Does it get more simple? Does it get easier to read than that? And that's what TRID is all about, is helping the borrower understand their figures, their bottom lines. The rest of 542 just kind of breaks down buyers and sellers. Buyers on the left, sellers on the right. We discussed last week that TRID requires lenders to provide two closing disclosure, one for the buyer, one for the seller. So in the real world, you're not going to see both people, all numbers on the same piece of paper like this. In the real world, you're going to have the buyer's numbers on their closing disclosure and seller's numbers on theirs. But this just gives us an idea how much that buyer has to bring to closing, how we got to that amount, and how much the seller is going to get from closing, hopefully going to get. Again, if the seller owes more than what the property is worth, they may have to bring money to closing too. I've talked a couple times about the housing market crash, for example, and we saw a lot of sellers that had to bring money to the table in order to sell that home. So if they owe, then that number will be a negative. And then the rest of the closing disclosure. So where we last left, the last thing we were talking about was what our role in all this is. And the Real Estate Commission says when it comes to the closing disclosure, we are held responsible for the accuracy of information that we should reasonably know. So when we get the closing disclosure from the attorney, we get it, a day or so before settlement to review. It is part of my responsibility to review these things for accuracy to make sure that my client's number is correct. Y'all remember OLCAR? And what's the A in OLCAR? Accounting. We're helping them account for their funds. And isn't their bottom line figures at the end of this transaction a big number to help them account for? Make sure your buyer's taking in the right and your seller's getting the right amounts. So we're going to help them. And that's where we're heading in this unit. And that's why you're going to spend more time with it post-licensing, so we can review these things. So let's talk about information that I should reasonably know. What are some things that I can check on the closing disclosure? What are some numbers I can verify? Well, for example, can't I verify that the sales price is right? The due diligence amount, the earnest money deposit, seller pay closing costs. Where am I getting that information? How do I verify that's right? Anybody want to stab a guess? Take a guess at it.
From the contract that you have?
Absolutely. I don't know about you guys, but my little brain doesn't work like what it used to. Anybody else with me? Every day. And when I get the closing disclosure, the first thing I do is go pull out my contract. I actually go find the contract and pull it out and look at it, because I want to make sure that the price that they agreed to, I want to make sure that the due diligence that they agreed to, the earnest money deposit they agreed to, need to make sure that that's accurate, that that's right. If we renegotiated the sales price, if we renegotiated any of those figures after contract, We want to make sure that they show up correctly on the closing disclosure. Other things I can verify. By the time I'm done with you guys tonight, I'll have you prorating taxes. So you'll be able to verify that your buyers and sellers prorated tax amount is correct. What about commission? Can I verify commission? Do I want to verify commission? Absolutely. Guys, paralegals, attorneys, lenders, they prepare these things and they make mistakes. They're human too, and they make mistakes. So the thinking is the more sets of eyes we can have on this thing, the better chance for accuracy we have. Here's the deal. Seller typically pays commission, which means commission's going to show up on the seller's closing disclosure. As a buyer's agent, you're not going to see that unless you're privy to the seller CD. So as a buyer's agent, you may want to call the attorney and say, just want to make sure my commission's right. As the listing agent one time, I was the listing agent, guy named Mike was the buyer's agent. And I got my seller CD the day before settlement. And commission was not on there at all. The whole amount had been left off. And I called the paralegal right away. And I said, hey, Mike and I want to get paid. And she said, and I quote, whoopsie. Whoopsie? Whoopsie? What the heck does that mean? I don't know what would have happened if I didn't catch it. I mean, my seller was a really nice lady, so I'd like to think that she'd be willing to sit down and write a check after closing if I didn't catch that. If not, we may have to take the firm may have chosen to take her to court. I don't know. But what I do know is I reviewed it and I found it. I caught it, and it was never an issue. It was never a thing. So it's really important that we're reviewing what we can to help for accuracy. Example of things that I couldn't be able to reasonably know. For example, I was not privy to the conversation between the lender and the borrower when the lender told the borrower what their fees were. I don't know what the lender told was the loan origination fee. I do know about what they typically run, 1%, 2%, 2.5%. So I know that it should be about that, but I don't know that exactly. If I saw 12%, I would have a flag go up and I'd be on the phone with the lender. So while there's some things that I can't know, I just can't know everything. We have a duty to review what we should reasonably know, what we can verify. And this is not the time when you find a mistake. This is not the time to be shy. It is our duty, it's our responsibility to pick up the phone and call the attorney and or the lender and say, we found an error. Failure to do so could be a disciplinary action from the Real Estate Commission. Again, we have violated our OCAR duties if we're not helping our buyers and sellers crunch those numbers and make sure that they're right for settlement. So this is where we left off last week. What questions do I have up until this point? So the last thing we have to do before we do this settlement meeting math, this mini CD, I call it, we got to wrap up a few more things on RESPA. Why don't you guys remind me in a chat? Let's get you warmed up. RESPA, private chat, RESPA is also known as regulation what? RESPA is regulation what? TILA's regulation something and RESPA is regulation something. Everybody in? Yeah. RESPA is also known as Regulation X. TILA is Z, RESPA is X. I think these are great candidates for a flashcard. What do y'all think? TILA is Z, RESPA is X. So talking a little bit more, again, RESPA is the R in TRID. We married the two, TILA and RESPA came together, and that's what gave us TRID. And talking just a little bit more, we are on page 551. 551.
What's the difference between the two?
TILA is Z, RESPA is X. TILA
No.
gives the lender advertising guidelines like trigger terms. TILA tells the consumer the cost to obtain the loan. RESPA tells the consumer the cost to close. TRID combined the two. TILA, RESPA, integrated disclosure. And I'm not sure if you know, I know you're here. I just heard you, but your camera's not on. I think you might have popped it off by accident. So talking a little bit more about how RESPA protects the consumer. Remember, that's the big picture of TRID. How can we protect the consumer? And talking a little bit more about how RESPA can protect the consumer on page 551. RESPA can require disclosure on controlled business arrangements. An example of a controlled business arrangement, this idea of having these one-stop shopping places is growing in popularity. So in other words, you may find a real estate agent, a closing attorney, and a mortgage lender under the same roof. And while I, as the agent, can't make this borrower use my lender and my attorney, I can absolutely recommend. Remember, we're always given choices. Here's a list of 2 or 3 lenders. Here's a list of 2 or 3 attorneys. If they choose the ones that I have this business arrangement with, I need to disclose that to the consumer. I need to let them know that if they use this lender or they use this attorney, the firm is probably going to make some kind of money. If nothing else, it's shared rent. So we have some kind of arrangement, some kind of working together. Your firm, if that's the case, if you join a firm that has a controlled business arrangement with others, they'll provide you with a form that you can use. You don't have to worry about creating your own. But RESPA just says we need to disclose to the consumer. They need to be clearly informed of any relationships. RESPA also requires a borrower credit for a yield spread premium. So a yield spread premium is just a fee paid to the mortgage broker. Remember, we said the higher the yield, the more sellable it is for the lender on the secondary market. And so some lenders have charged a premium to increase their yield. And in the past, they would let the buyer pay for that. RESPA said, nope, not fair. If you charge the buyer for you to have a higher yield, then we need to see a credit to this buyer at closing. That shouldn't be a cost borne on the consumer. RESPA put restrictions on the escrow account that the lender has for the borrower to collect taxes and insurance every month so they can pay those bills at the end of the year. You know how we've been saying the lender charges 1/12 of the annual taxes and 1/12 of the annual homeowner's insurance? That 1/12 is a RESPA requirement. The lender can only charge 1/12 of the annual taxes and 1/12 of the homeowner's insurance. My homeowners on the call know that sometimes your mortgage payment goes up, right? Sometimes you get a letter, it says, hey, you got to send us more money this year. It's not because your principal and interest change. Remember, that's flat. That stays the same for the life of the loan. But what may cause your monthly mortgage payment to go up is because taxes went up or insurance went up. So they can adjust the 1/12 to collect the full amount, but they can't charge more than 1/12. The other piece of this, RESPA regulates how much the lender can collect at closing from the borrower to originate and fund the escrow account. There's fees involved in getting that sent up. The lender's going to want to collect a little cushion for the escrow account. So if taxes and insurance do go up next year, they have a little bit of cushion to still pay those bills on your behalf. Again, those are all restricted on how much they can collect. It's not a free-for-all. RESPA puts requirements on loan servicing disclosure. If your loan is bought or sold, it's serviced. When you see loan servicing, that's what we're referring to, it being bought or sold. Whether or not your loan can be bought or sold needs to be disclosed at the time of application. If after the loan's originated, or when after the loan is originated, the lender services the loan to another lender. They sold your loan to another lender. And in that case, RESPA requirements say that you should get 2 pieces of mail. One letter from the lender that sold your loan saying, we have sold your loan. Another letter from the lender that purchased your loan saying, we now have your loan. So disclosing to the consumer that it can be done. And then when it actually happens. And then the last one that we're going to talk about are kickbacks and referral fees. This is the one that hurt us. RESPA says you can't give or receive a kickback or a referral fee for recommending settlement service providers. So if I recommend a lender, for example, if I tell my buyer to call a certain lender, the lender can't buy me a gift. All the lender can do is pick up the phone and say, thank you for sending me that buyer. We cannot give or receive kickbacks or referral fees for recommending service providers. You and I are settlement service providers. The lender, the attorney, the home inspector, all those people, remember our gears last week? All those people on those gears that are involved in the contract to closing process, we are all settlement service providers. So let's look at a couple examples of how life used to be before TRID. Home inspector pays a real estate broker a $25 referral fee for each buyer the broker refers to the home inspector. Heck yeah, where am I sending every single one of my buyers? To this home inspector. That adds up. Is he a good home inspector? I don't care. I want my $25. Do you see why this is not what's in the best interest for the consumer? Because who am I looking after in this point? Me, absolutely. I love this one. For each borrower referred by a real estate broker, a mortgage loan officer places a number drawing ticket into a box and gives the broker a stub. At a pre-designated point in time, a ticket is drawn. The broker with the winning ticket receives an all expenses paid cruise. Yes, I'm sending every single buyer to that lender. I really don't care if they do a good job or not. I want another chance to win that cruise. RESPA decided, and I guess rightfully so, that this wasn't what's in the best interest of the consumer. TRID is not about protecting me and you. TRID is about protecting the consumer. We should always give the consumer choices. We're going to say stuff like, here's the name of 2 or 3 lenders that I've used in the past. Feel free to contact them, encourage them to shop around. If you're new to the business and you don't know any lenders yet, then it's a safe chance, a safe bet to say that your firm has a preferred vendor list. So now, while you're meeting those lenders, you can say something like, here's a list of 3 lenders that my firm has used, until you start forming those relationships and building your own preferred vendor list. Never, ever look at a buyer and say, this is the lender you're going to use, period, end of story. Give them choices. And y'all don't send them to Google. Do you know what kind of junk they can find on Google? So rely on personal information. This is why they have you. Again, until you form those relationships, use your firm's preferred vendor list. Settlement service providers, and they're starting to come back out. We're starting to get stuff again. Settlement service, let me say, RESPA says, I cannot receive $1. I cannot receive a donut for recommending a settlement service provider. Lenders, for example, may come to your office and they may drop off a box of donuts. I'm telling you guys, if you like donuts, you are getting in the right industry. People love to drop off a box of donuts. The lender can walk in the door with a box of donuts and a stack of business cards and say, I'm going to put these in the conference room table. You guys enjoy. Let me know if I can help. They can do that. What they can't do is walk in the door with a box of donuts and say, these are for you, you, and you, because you sent me business last month. What they do for one, they need to do for all. They can't thank you for sending them business. All they can do is pick up the phone and call. This one hurt. No more all expense paid cruises, you guys. Sorry. Laptop. I know that was a drawing one year from a lender for a laptop, a tablet, something. Yeah, they gave some nice stuff. Why? Because they wanted you to send all their buyers to them. Didn't care if they were good or not. They just wanted you to send all your buyers to them. Now we're giving the buyers choices. You guys, please always remember, you're not the one buying this house. These decisions on what to spend, on how much and who, should not be up to you. I can make recommendations, but ultimately the buyer needs to decide. If I recommend 3 lenders, does the buyer have to use any of those? No, all I'm doing is making recommendations. I had a pleasant experience. The biggest thing we want to make sure we do is suggest them to shop around. Not all lenders are created equal. So we want to make sure that our buyers shop around. So penalties for violating RESPA. I hear you, gee, Julie, what's the big deal? It's only a $25 gift card to Amazon. How bad can it hurt? Ouch. For receiving that $25 gift card, you could be looking up to $10,000 per violation. So now you're out of the hole, what, $9,975? Yeah. You could be looking up to a year in prison. An injunction is a legal stop. If the court or the commission put a legal stop on you, you can't practice real estate while this is being investigated. If it's found that you financially harm somebody, you could have to compensate the victims. And then you could be responsible for both parties' court costs. Treble the damages of court costs. Y'all know what treble means? Yeah, you take the damages, the court costs, and you times it by 3. Is it worth the $25 Target gift card? I can't really answer that for you, but I mean, here it is, you know. Questions on RESPA? And please hear me when I say to or from settlement service providers. So if somebody offers you a $25 gift card, we need to say, no, thank you. Just because they offer it doesn't make it okay. RESPA says to or from settlement service providers. Questions? So now what we need to start doing is talking about our settlement statement math. And the first thing I want to do before we start the conversation, what I've done is gone through the book and compiled the pages in your book that discuss the settlement statement. So I want you to have this all here in one place as your reference. So you know where to get this information that we're getting ready to talk about. Preparation of settlement statement in your book on page 553. We're going there next. There's also a math concepts in this unit. That's on page 556. What would that be? Olayde, what does this? Some proration scenarios. You guys remember back in unit 3, and we introduced you guys to calculating the annual taxes, and we figured out how to find the annual taxes. Well, back in unit 3, it also talks about prorations, which is where we're heading. And at that time, I told you guys to skip it. Let's just focus on finding the annual taxes. We'll worry about prorating later. Well, now we're here to prorate. So you may want to go back to page 61 in unit 3, where it talks about some different scenarios. Thank you. Question comes in, does accepting thank you gifts apply to clients too? Great question. It's settlement service providers. So buyer and seller are not considered a settlement service provider. We can give and receive closing gifts to and from our clients. Thank you. So proration scenarios back in page 61. And then there's that math facts section in the back of your book. And again, these are the pages that kind of dance around the settlement statement. So you guys have some good resources on how we can do the settlement statement math. Of course, we're going to go through it. We're going to talk about it as well. What you guys are doing, what we are getting ready to do, I refer to as a mini closing disclosure. So you don't have to do the full-blown closing disclosure we just saw in your book until you get to post. But we do need to figure out, you guys will see a question on your test that says, how much does the buyer have to bring to closing? So we're figuring out just half of it. We're looking at the buyer's debits and credits. We're looking at the seller's debits and credits as well. Because do you think your test may like to trick you and throw in a seller debit? So why do we have to talk about the seller's debits? Because we got to avoid those tricks. We got to avoid those distractions. But again, your test question is going to ask you, how much does the buyer need to bring to closing? So for our mini CD, what's my focus on? The buyer. The seller stuff is a distraction. When you guys are sitting down to do your test, both my end of class exam and PSI state exam, I always want you to do the math last. Save the math for the very end. You guys have all been through Class Marker now, and you know how to bookmark a question so you can go back to it. If you need another refresher, I got the link in the email with the little tutorial, so you can check that out. But I do recommend that you guys always save the math for last, because the math is going to take you the longest. Remember what I've been saying since day one. The math alone can't fail you. So in other words, I don't want you using all of your test time trying to get the math and then not have enough time to answer the rest of it. So test taking strategy, save the math for last, and then you know how much time you have left. Of the math, save the mini closing disclosure for the very, very last. Because that one of the math will take you the absolute longest. This one is the most work. It's the most to do, the most to calculate, and you still only get one test point for it. They're not giving you multiple points for getting it right or wrong. When we used to teach face-to-face back in the day, and I heard you guys, and we would go out on break. You guys would go out in the hall or you'd stand in the room, and I would hear some of you guys go, this is too much work. I'm not going to worry about this till I get my license. I'm just not going to worry about it. Well, I mean, that's fine. If that's what you want to do, we're all adults. You do what you want to do. You're going to have to learn it eventually. I don't know why we shouldn't try now, why we shouldn't get through it. And even though it's only one test question, it's of my opinion that this is probably the most important math that we're going to go over, because, OCAR, this is what we owe our clients. This is the duty that we owe our clients. So if you choose to ignore it for now until you get affiliated, that's fine. Just mark down B and move on, or C or A or whatever your favorite number is. When you affiliate with your firm and your broker in charge looks at you and says, did y'all not go over this in pre-licensing? Do not look at your BIC and say, no, we didn't do it. Fair enough? There's a chance I may know your BIC, depending on where you are. So this is up to you. I'm trying to be very transparent with you guys. A lot of work for one question. You're not going to walk away from this class today as experts on doing the mini closing disclosure. How do you get good at it? Practice, practice, practice. I got plenty of practice for you guys. Start learning it now. Everybody have these page numbers written down? Your reference? Okay. So the first thing in settlement statement math is talking about what we're dealing with. Good news, we're only dealing with debits and credits. Debit is an amount to be paid. It's money going out. Credit is money coming in. It's coming in on your behalf. When you go to the grocery store tomorrow and you're at the cash register and you pull your card out and you swipe it, how does that look on your end? How does that look on your statement? Doesn't that show up as a debit? That money at Harris Teeter is coming out of your account. That's money that you owe. When your job hands you a check, a bonus check for doing such a good job, and you run and deposit that thing into your account, how does that appear into your account? That appears, that's right, as a credit. It's money coming in on your behalf. So we're dealing with money to be paid and money payable. We have danced around this idea of proration, so we're finally here. Let me ask you guys this. What is today? February 14th. If you buy my house today, you just buy my house today, is it fair for either one of us to pay the full year's taxes? You only had it for what, 10.5 months? I only had it for 1.5 months, but still neither one of us owned it all year, did we? So it's not fair for either one of us to pay the full amount. How do we make this fair? Well, we prorate. We take that amount, that shared expense, and we divvy it between the two parties. So proration is just dividing something, it's just making it fair. I'm going to be responsible for 1.5 months of taxes. You're going to be responsible for 10.5 months of taxes, give or take. Isn't that fair? Doesn't that seem fair? Nobody's paying more than what they need to. We're all paying our fair share. So the whole point of prorating is to make it fair. And as we've been saying, one thing that we can prorate is this year's taxes, If the seller didn't pay 2022 taxes, that is solely on them. That is solely a debit to the seller. The buyer wasn't around in 2022. So delinquent taxes is on the seller. What we're going to prorate is this year's taxes. Other than this year's property taxes, other things that we're going to typically prorate between the buyer and the seller at settlement are HOA dues, if applicable. HOA dues may be monthly, they may be quarterly, they may be annually. The problem has to tell you. But again, you buy my house today, if HOA dues are monthly, Is it fair for me to be responsible for the entire month of February? No. Is it fair for you? No. So we're going to make it fair. How do we make it fair? By prorating it. The other thing that we're going to prorate, another, not expense, but another amount of money that we're going to share between us is if the unit comes, if the property comes with a tenant, the buyer buys honoring the existing tenant. The buyer buys honoring any existing leases. So this month's rent needs to be shared between the buyer and the seller. It needs to be prorated. For our purposes, for your exams, rent's due and payable on the 1st. Unless you're told otherwise, of course. Always do what the problem tells you. So remember, all this time we've been talking about pre-licensing world and real world. This is one of the best examples of why we're going to put real world off to the side to get you through these tests. Forget about the real world for a minute. You are in pre-licensing world. And in pre-licensing world, for both of your exams, we're going to use a 30-day month and a 360-day year. In pre-licensing, every single month has 30 days. 30 times 12, we'll see in a bit. 30 times 12 is 360. Good news, now you don't have to take all that brain energy to remember how many days are in March, right? 30 days. So in pre-licensing world, how many days are in February? 30. In pre-licensing day world, how many days are in October? 30. We don't get a Halloween in pre-licensing world. Man, every single day has every single month has 30 days.
Even February?
Every single month has 30 days, February included. Again, post-licensing, now you need to know the actual days of the month. They give you a little reprieve right here. This is for both of your exams. You may see a practice problem that tells you to use the calendar year. If the practice problem tells you to use the calendar year, you always do what the problem tells you. I'm telling you, for both of your tests, it's a 30-day month and a 360-day year. Again, practice problems, do what the problem tells you. So we've already figured this out. If I have annual taxes and I want to make them monthly, how do I convert annual to monthly? We did this when we amortized, didn't we? So we're going to divide that by 12 months in a year, right? So when you have an annual figure and you want to break it down to monthly, we divide by 12. What if you have an annual figure and you want to break it down to daily? Now we're going to take the annual and divide it by how many days in the year? 360. Do I have everybody on this board? So let's just look at an example together. I want you guys just to put your pencils down, taking it in. We're going to talk about prorating. And, you know, I'm just the throw you in the deep end kind of gal. I got plenty of practice for you guys. Don't worry. But let's just say we're looking at this problem. It says a property is located in Davie County, is subject to ad valorem tax rate of 80 cents per $100 of value. Property's assessed tax value is $172,500 using the 360-day year. What are the daily property taxes owed on the home? So this is a great refresher from Unit 3. You know what? I said put your pencils down, but I'm going to take that back. And now even, you guys remember the T-bar? Annual taxes as a part of assessed value and the tax rate. Yeah, why don't you pick your pencils up? Tell me in a private chat, what are the daily properties? So first you got to find the annual. First you got to find the annual taxes. And then as you guys just told me, once you find the annual, you divide by 360 to get daily. So this is a great refresher from the Unit 3 math. Do about 30 more seconds, then we'll talk about it. Okay. So we've read the problem. We know we can use the T-bar. The first thing we need to do is find the annual taxes. So the problem gives me the assessed value. I'm solving for annual taxes. It gives me the assessed value of 172,500. And then it tells me my taxes are 80 cents per $100. You guys remember what the word per means in this case? The word per means divide. So your problem, your formula is right there. 80 cents divided by 100 gives me a rate of 0.008. Up, down line in the T-bar means multiply. So we take 172,500 times 0.008. And I get annual taxes of $1,380. The problem wants daily. In pre-licensing world, how many days are in a year? 360. So we take our annual, divide them by 360, and that gives me daily taxes. Whoops, 3.83. This is the number that we're going to take in just a bit. We're going to figure out how many days of the year does the seller owe? How many days of the year does the buyer owe? This is the number, the daily taxes. It's going to help us figure out what is the seller's fair share and what is the buyer's fair share. Do I have any questions so far on how we got the 3.83, how we got that daily tax figure? Just so far, I'm just easing you in. Do you live in Guilford County? No? Guilford's known for high taxes. Doesn't have anybody in High Point? It's been in High Point for like 20 years or so. They opened, do y'all remember when they opened Laurel Oak Ranch? And it was just across the county border. It was just in, like, if you go down Main Street. And Laurel Oak Ranch opened in, I think it's Davidson County. People ran to Laurel Oak Ranch because you could live in High Point and not have to pay Guilford County taxes. That's really not the reputation that county, but you know, that's what they're known for, high taxes. So each county's different. All right. We're going to get everybody good. Can I erase the red? Very good. Okay. It's break time. So we're going to go ahead and take a break. We come back. We're going to keep going on this settlement statement. We'll pick the calculator up after break. So grab your calculator if you don't have it. And we're back. So I'm going to take attendance. I'm going to jump back in. A little bit more about prorating in just 1 minute. Also with the settlement statement, also with prorating, again, just identifying the words. You may hear about things that are accrued. You may hear about things that are prepaid. If something has accrued, that means it's unpaid. The seller has not paid it yet. If something is prepaid, that means it's already been paid by the seller. So again, understanding the language that we may see in these problems. Accrued is unpaid. Prepaid means it's already been paid by the seller. Very important regarding the settlement statement and prorations. Anytime that we're prorating, anytime that we're prorating an item between the buyer and the seller is going to be responsible for the day of closing. So who pays today's real property taxes? Who's responsible for that $383 on the day of closing? The seller. Who pays today's HOA dues? The sellers. Who gets to keep today's rent? The seller. They get the day of closing. I always remember it this way. The day of closing, when we woke up this morning, when our alarms went off this morning, the seller still owned the property. The deed was still in their name. At some point today, that deed is going to change hands. Yes, if the day goes according to plan, at some point today, that deed will change hands. So when our alarms went off this morning, the seller owned the property. Doesn't matter if closing happens at 8 a.m. or 4:59 p.m. We're always going to charge the seller. When we wake up tomorrow, who hopefully owns the property? We can't really call them the buyer anymore, can we? Because today or tomorrow, they are the new owner. So when we prorate, and this is where this is important, this is the biggest problem topic. We only consider the seller responsible for the day of closing when I'm prorating items between the buyer and the seller. The buyer has some of their own charges with the lender. The buyer is going to be responsible for paying charges to their lender the day of closing. Lender fees are not prorated between the buyer and the seller. The seller is going to have loan payoff, mortgage loan payoff, for example. They're going to have to pay fees and dues for the day of closing. The buyer has nothing to do with the seller's loan payoff. So the day of closing, each party is responsible for their own individual debits and credits. This is only when we prorate. And what did we just say the 3 things we typically prorate are? This year's taxes, HOA dues, and rent. So what are the 3 things that we typically see prorated? This year's taxes, HOA dues, and rent. And that is when we're prorating. That's we're going to allow the seller to be responsible for the day of closing. So they get to pay that day, or in the case of the rent, or in some cases, they're responsible, meaning they get the day of closing. Either they owe it or they keep it. We mentioned the real world. Again, I just have this here. You're going to see practice problems. You're going to need to know the actual days of the month. You don't necessarily need to write this down. You just got to do what the practice problem tells you. So if, for example, the practice problem has you prorating in May and it tells you to use a calendar year, you got to do it 31 days to get it right. Okay, there's the real world, and then there's pre-licensing world. So having a calendar in front of you when you do practice problems for real world, knowing how many days are in the month for your exams. Every single month has 30 days. 30 times 12 is 360. So when it comes to proration, and you can use page 561, it gives you a nice recap. Tells us how we're going to handle prorations. First off, prorated items are a double entry item. A double entry item means it's going to show up how many times on the settlement statement? Double entry means it's going to show up twice, isn't it? Once under the buyer, once under the seller. And part of prorating is knowing who is responsible. It's always going to be a debit to one party and a credit to the other. A true proration is always a debit to one party and a credit to the other for the same amount. Put real estate aside for a second. Just put it aside for a second. And let's say I'm going to hand you a check. Do you want a check? So I'm going to hand you a check. You can make up your own amount. Have fun with that. So I hand you a check. Isn't the amount of the check the same when it leaves my hand and it enters yours? Did that amount of the check change? No, it's the same. When it leaves my hand, it's a debit, right? It's money coming out of my account. When it hits your hand, it's a credit. It's money coming in. A true proration is a debit one party, credit the other for the same amount. Now, bring real estate back into it. Real estate closing, buyers and sellers are not handing each other checks. We hash it all out on the settlement statement by discussing debits and credits. And this helps us get to our bottom line figures. So there's your breakdown. That tells you your taxes, if they're unpaid or prepaid. There's your rent. There's your owner's association dues, HOA. Hang on to interest. We'll talk about that later, one thing at a time. So we'll talk about interest on an assumed loan, maybe tomorrow. Maybe we'll save that for Thursday, but we'll come back and visit that. But again, this just gives you what party is the debit, what party is the credit. So we're going to walk through the different scenarios that you're going to see with prorated items. And the first scenario, you may see if items are unpaid. They're accrued. If items are unpaid prior to settlement, it's going to show up as a debit to the seller and a credit to the buyer. When I prorate, I like pictures. You guys starting to like pictures a little bit? Pictures kind of help, don't they? So if I'm prorating this year's taxes, I have my timeline for the year, January 1st to December 30th. Remember, we're in pre-licensing world. So how many days in December? I've not gone crazy. How many days in December? Only 30. What divides the timeline is the date of settlement. So let's go to closing today, which makes the date of settlement February 14th. The seller owns the property the front part of the year. The buyer owns the property the latter part of the year. We've taken the timeline and we've identified who's responsible for what period of time. Don't even pick a calculator up. Who owes more in taxes this year? Is it the buyer or the seller? Who's going to have a bigger responsibility? It's going to be the buyer, right? Because the seller only owned it from January 1st, February 14th. Buyer's responsibility starts tomorrow. So drawing the timeline, a lot of times, especially with proration, we can look at numbers, which one's bigger, which one's smaller, just by looking at the timeline. And I have seen practice test questions that you can answer. Practice math proration test questions that you can answer without ever touching a calculator. If you understand the debit to one party and the credit to other and who has the bigger responsibility. So draw the timeline, see your picture. Taxes are unpaid, which means at some point later in the year, the buyer is going to be responsible for paying the full amount. Now, when I say the buyer's responsible, they probably won't be sending that check in because we know the lender's been collecting that in escrow, right? The buyer's responsibility means that the lender is going to pay that bill on their behalf. But ultimately, the buyer's going to be responsible. So December rolls around and the buyer's responsible for the entire year's taxes. One of the early things I want you guys to ask yourselves, and this is a very important question to help us understand prorating. Early on, after we draw our timeline, I want you to stop and ask yourself, who owes who? If the buyer is going to be responsible for the entire year's taxes, who owes who? How do we make this fair? I see mouths moving. So who owes who? The seller owes the buyer, debit the seller, credit the buyer, for the period of time, including the day of settlement, that the seller owned the property. So the seller owes the buyer. Guys, in this scenario, could you imagine if this didn't happen? December rolls around, taxes are due, buyer calls the seller and says, hey man, our taxes are due, send me some money. What's the seller going to say? Ha 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 ha, and hang up, right? Please understand, the whole idea of settlement is to settle everything between the buyer and the seller. When we leave the closing table, we should be done with each other. And that means any additional monies, such as monies for this year's taxes. So on the settlement statement, we're going to see a debit the seller, credit the buyer. There are 30 days in January. There are 14 days in February. So the seller is going to owe the seller for 45 days of taxes. Remember, we just took the annual and divided by 360 to get daily. What was that number we got? 3.83. So if we use that number as an example, 3.83 times 45 tells us at settlement, we're going to see a debit. Did I not add right? See, this is why I don't go off calculator. Yeah, I just don't. So hang on, let's fix this. So we got 30 days in January plus 14 days. So on calculator, 30 plus 14, thank you, gives us 44. Thank you. And our fake number, we said $3.83 a day, so times 3.83. So at settlement, we're going to see a double entry item of $168.52. Debit the seller, credit the buyer. The seller is giving the buyer their portion of the money at settlement. That is this much less money that the buyer has to bring to closing. Are we fair now? Does this make things fair? Nobody wants to pay an extra 44 days. I mean, it's only $168.52, but in the big picture of buying a house, $168.52 can be a big deal. Yes. So the whole idea of prorating is to make it fair. So if it's unpaid prior to settlement, I got a few more scenarios to walk through. If it's unpaid prior to settlement, any item that's unpaid, it's going to be a debit the seller, credit the buyer. Who can remind me? Why don't all of you remind me in a private chat? From Unit 3, we looked at our taxation timetable. And when is the tax bill due? When is the tax bill due each year? When is it due? I love the question marks. Not due by, due. When is the due date? So let's go back to our taxation timetable. We're kind of all over the place. Page 64, hold your place in the book. And let's go back to page 64. The bill comes, or the lien is filed on the 1st. The bill is mailed in August. It's due and payable on September 1st. If you have a, and this is important, if you have a problem with a closing date before September 1st, the problem probably won't tell you that it's unpaid. Because we know if closing is before September 1st, is there any possible way that it can be paid? No, the bill's not even due yet. So if it doesn't tell you, it might say closing's on February 14th, prorated, and it's not going to tell you if it's unpaid. So we're connecting Unit 3 and Unit 21. We're at a great time to go back and review Unit 3. So these scenarios, this unpaid, debit the seller, credit the buyer. This is a scenario of unpaid taxes when closing happens before September 1st. Questions so far? Can I erase the red? Okay. So what's the scenario? This is before September 1st, taxes unpaid. So what's the scenario if we have closing after September 1st? Taxes are still unpaid, but now it's after September 1st. We have a bill now, don't we? We know exactly how much. We know that they are due. If closing happens after September 1st and taxes are unpaid, we're going to do something called a double debit. With a double debit, how many parties are going to see a debit? Both of them. Each party is going to pay their fair share. Again, timeline doesn't hurt, does it? Allows us to see what we're working with here. So I got my annual taxes. Now let's say we go to closing on, what do you want to go to closing? Let's go right after Thanksgiving. So now we go to closing on November 30th. Seller still owns the front part of the year. Buyer still owns the latter part of the year. Don't pick up a calculator. Who has the bigger responsibility? Whose number is going to be bigger? The seller. I really like the timeline. And I recommend you guys give it a shot because it gives us a visual. We just took that word problem and we put it in a picture. So it tells us that taxes are unpaid. Closing happens after September 1st. Instead of doing a proration, the closing attorney will do a debit the seller for the period of time that they own the property, including the day of settlement. And then they're also going to do a debit the buyer for the period of time that they own the property. The parties aren't going to share their expense. The seller is going to pay their fair share, the buyer is going to pay their fair share, and the attorney is going to send one check into the county to pay this year's taxes. Does the county care where this year's taxes come from? May it be the homeowner, the attorney? The county doesn't care, do they? They just want to collect taxes on this year's property taxes for this year. So whether or not they're unpaid, the first thing, when you see unpaid, the first thing you need to stop and ask yourself is, when is closing? If it's before September 1st, it'll be debit the seller, credit the buyer. If it's after September 1st, it's going to be a double debit. Each party will pay their fair share. So two possible scenarios with unpaid. Questions? So our third proration scenario, can I erase? Everybody good? Erase the red. Third proration scenario says taxes, for example, have been paid prior to settlement. Shake your head, yes or no. If they're prepaid, can settlement happen before September 1st? Prepaid? September 1st? No, we don't have the bill yet, do we? So if they're prepaid, taxes, or excuse me, closing's happening after September 1st. Prepaid means the seller has already paid this year's taxes. So again, when we prorate, we draw our timeline. I'm looking at the year. If it's HOA dues, if it's monthly HOA dues, our timeline is just for the month. In this case, because we're talking about real property taxes, it's for the year. Taxes have been prepaid, which means closing has to happen after September 1st. So now this time, let's go to closing like right after Thanksgiving. We'll go on November 25th. Seller on the property the front part of the year, buyer owns property the latter part of the year. Don't even touch a calculator. Whose numbers are going to be bigger? Whose responsibility is going to be bigger? The sellers, because they owned it for the longer period of time. They're prepaid, which means the seller has already paid the entire year's taxes. Is that fair to the seller to pay the entire year's taxes? No, they didn't own the property the whole year. So how do we make it fair? We prorate. So stop and ask yourself, always when prorating, ask yourself, who owes who? If the sellers paid the taxes for the whole year, who owes who? Now we're going to do a debit the buyer, credit the seller. The buyer owes for the day after closing to the end of the year. When you're counting forward on the timeline, like we are right now, when you're counting forward, it's easy to get the days mixed up. It's easy to get the number of days wrong. And so I have a tried and true method to help you properly count the number of days. Are you guys ready for my big secret? I want you to count it out on your fingers. So when we're talking about November, I want you to count it out and say the buyer owes the seller for November 26th, 27th, 28th, 29th, and 30th. There are 5 days left in November plus 30 days in December. Is it really easy to look at November and see 4 days? Really easy to look at November. And guess what? If you look at that and you see 4 days, you just got the whole problem wrong. Not because you don't know what you're doing, but because you don't know how to count. So take that out of the equation and count on your fingers. The 26th, the 27th, the 28th, the 29th, and the 30th. I've had students go to PSI Testing Center and tell me they count on their fingers. Great. I got you guys counting on your fingers. I got you looking at your butts, don't I? How's interest paid? Paid in arrears. I got you guys doing all sorts of weird stuff at PSI Testing Center. Guess what? I don't care how you look. We just want to get you to pass, right? So count it out. When you're counting forward, count it out on your fingers. And I believe if I'm doing math without a calculator, 5 days in November plus 30 days left. 35 look right? I can't go off calculator sometimes. I don't like to. The buyer owes the seller for the day after settlement through the end of the year. They're reimbursing the seller for them already paying taxes. And it's going to show up as a debit the buyer, credit the seller. Seller's always responsible for the day of closing when prorating between the buyer and the seller. Prorating, draw the timeline, put the information from the problem into a visual So you can actually see what you're looking at. I'm telling you, some of these problems, you may never have to touch a calculator. Who owes who and how much? Whose responsibility is bigger? Questions on prorating. The example we've been given is prorating annual taxes. You could do this with annual HOA. You could do this with monthly HOA, monthly rent. Your timeline is reflective of the period of time that we're prorating. Again, 561 and 562 are your key. They're your guides. Let's think of 561 and 562 as your formula for doing these problems. So understanding what's a debit to what party, 561 goes over prorated items. Understanding what's a debit to one party, what's a credit to the other is like crucial in doing these. So 561 and 562 are your formulas. So what we're going to do now is go through 561 and 562. And I know you have it in front of you, but we're also going to go through a quick discussion. We're going to break it down per party. We're going to break down the seller's debits and credits, and we're going to break down the buyer's debits and credits. So we've looked at the prorations. Can I erase the red? Everybody good? Okay. So 561 and 562 gives us a breakdown of what the seller's debits and credits are. Things that are typically a debit to the seller. They're going to pay your commission unless the problem tells you otherwise. Seller typically pays commission. But y'all always have to do what the problem tells you. Seller pays to have the deed prepared. The attorney's got to put it together. They got to fill in the blanks. They got to add the information. The seller pays to have that deed prepared. I always remember it this way. When the attorney is preparing the deed for closing, it's still the seller's deed. The seller hasn't changed it over yet. So they get to pay the deed preparation fee. The seller also typically pays excise tax. We looked at excise tax back in Unit 5. If you can remember CDE, you can remember, somebody remembers DEC, I don't care. Commission, deed preparation fee, and excise tax. Again, if our problems are going to ask you, how much does the buyer have to bring to closing? Why do I care about the seller's debits? I wouldn't put it past them on your test to give you the amount for the deed preparation fee. You need to know the seller's debits and credits so you know your distractors. In addition to CDE, if you will, turn with me to page 562. In addition to CDE, there are also seller paying off their existing liens and mortgage. That would be a debit to the seller. There's the seller paying delinquent property taxes, delinquent taxes. They never paid 2022 taxes. That will be a debit to the seller. If they're delinquent on their personal property taxes, that will be a debit to the seller. Those are debits that are specific to the seller. Commission, deed prep, and excise tax go either way. So what I'm telling you is, unless you're told otherwise, the seller's responsible for commission, deed prep, and excise tax, plus some of their other expenses on page 562. The other debit we're going to see to the seller, go back to 561, we're hopping back and forth, I know, is going to be the due diligence fee. Do I have any accountants or accounting brains on the call? You don't need to take an accounting class to know this. How does an accountant cancel out a debit? What's the opposite of a debit? a credit. How do you zero it out? You do the opposite. If it's a debit, you do credit. You can't zero it out. But let's reverse. Let's go back in time for a minute. Remember when we went under contract and the buyer handed the seller a check? Now that we're at settlement, we need to reverse that. Back in the day when we went under contract, that was a credit to the seller, right? They received the check, they ran and deposited it in their account. Today at settlement, we need to reverse that, and due diligence will be a debit to the seller. They've already received that money once. We don't want them to receive it again. The credit to the seller, that purchase price, isn't that the whole gist of our contract? The buyer promises to pay the seller. That's money going out of the buyer's hand into the seller's hand in exchange for what? The property. That's the whole gist of it. So the sales price is going to show up as a credit to the seller. This is my recommendation. We're going to see in just a minute that the buyer has a lot more debits than the seller. The buyer has a lot more that they owe than the seller. I recommend you knowing these so you know anything else is going to be a debit to the buyer. A lot less to remember. I think all these are great candidates for a flashcard. I think you guys should take pictures or make a copy of 561 and 562. So you have that on your phone. So you can refer to it periodically, because again, 561 and 562 are your formulas. If you don't know what's a debit to one party or credit to the other, you can't do the settlement. I used to jokingly say, rip this page out of your book, until somebody did it once, and then it like messed up their whole book and it was falling apart by the end of the class. So don't rip the page out of your book. We live and we learn, don't we? Take a picture with your phone. So when you're sitting at the drive-thru, you can pull it up. And you can say, oh yeah, these are things that are debits to the seller. These are things that are credits to the seller, etc. So if these are the seller's debits and credits, let's talk about the buyer. And first off, let's talk about the buyer's debits. Over on 562, the sales price is a debit to the buyer, credit to the seller, debit to the buyer. Anything related to the buyer's due diligence that hasn't already been paid. A lot of home inspectors, for example, will let the buyer pay for the home inspection at settlement. They can roll it into their closing costs. Now, home inspectors may also say, if you pay in cash on the day of the home inspection, I'll knock off 10%. Not all buyers can do that. Some buyers are strapped for cash when they're trying to buy a house. So a lot of our inspectors, surveyors, inspections, investigations will allow the buyer to pay at closing. And if it hasn't already been paid, which the problem will have to tell you if it has, if it hasn't already been paid, then those charges related to the buyer's due diligence are going to be a debit to the buyer. Lender fees. We talked about loan origination fees. Talked about discount points. In just a minute, we're going to talk about something called interim interest. The lender fees are paid by the buyer to the lender. That's the relationship between the buyer and the borrower. So buyer's going to pay their lender's fees. The buyer hires the attorney, so they get to pay the attorney's fees. The buyer gets to pay to have their brand new deed recorded. The buyer gets to pay to have the lender's deed of trust recorded. And then they're going to originate their title insurance policy today. One-time charge title insurance. You don't have to renew it every year. Buyer pays it one time at settlement, and that shows up as a debit to the buyer. I want you guys to look with me on page 562. I want to identify a problem topic. On page 562, under the seller, it says that the seller pays the deed preparation fee. Everybody see that? 1, 2, 3 down under the seller. Seller pays the deed preparation fee. Now look at the buyer. They pay the deed recording fee. The seller pays to have it prepared. The buyer pays to have it recorded. When the attorney's getting the deed ready for closing, when they're preparing it for closing, it's still the seller's.
I was just going to ask that question.
What's that?
Why on both, isn't that a double entry, but you finished it right away, so.
Oh, good. So when they're preparing it, when they're getting it ready and filling in the blanks and doing what they need to do to take it to settlement, it's still the seller's deed. So they get to pay to have it prepared. Whose best interest is it to have their brand new deed put on record to protect their interest and protect their new property? The buyers. So they get to pay to have it recorded. Does everybody see that difference? Prepared versus recorded. There are some items, again, unless your problem tells you otherwise, there are some items that are POC, which means paid outside of closing. And unless you're told otherwise, those POC items, the buyer's already paid for their appraisal. The appraiser is not going to go out and do their thing until they've been paid. So that's going to be paid before closing. The other POC is going to be the credit report fee. When they first talk to the lender's going to charge them a small amount to pull their credit. These serve as distractors. They've already been paid. Don't charge your buyer again for them at settlement. They will tell you the appraisal. They will tell you the credit report fee. But we need to know that these things are POC. They've already been paid. Do not include them on your settlement statement, your mini CD. The other piece of the buyers is their credits. This list is a lot shorter. Buyer's credits on 562. The buyer's new loan amount today, on the day of settlement, is a credit to the buyer. Let's take a snapshot of today. What's going on today? Isn't the lender bringing that money on behalf of the buyer? Like, the buyer can't close. They cannot fulfill their part of the obligation if they don't have the money they're bringing and the money that the lender's bringing. So today, the day of settlement, the loan will be a credit to the buyer. The lender's bringing them that money. They're saying, here you go. Here's the money you need to buy this house. The buyer will spend the next 30 years paying the lender back. So on the day of settlement, on our settlement statement, the loan is going to be a credit to the buyer. And then remember we went under contract and we told your buyer, you pay the due diligence, you pay the earnest money, and both of them will be credited back to you at settlement. So we need to make sure that we give them their credit for their due diligence fee, give them their credit for their earnest money deposit. Questions on what's a debit to who, credit to who? Again, what we're looking at is typical. Give me some thumbs up. Does everybody hear me? Always do what the problem tells you. What we're looking at is typical. If the problem tells you to do otherwise, Always do what the problem tells you.
So in the word of advanced escrow deposits, we're talking, that's your earnest money, right?
Advanced escrow deposit, that would be a lender fee. We're gonna talk about that. But that advance, remember the escrow account restrictions we talked about with RESPA? And they put restrictions on the lender about how much they can collect at settlement to originate the escrow account. And so that's what we're doing at settlement. The lender's gonna collect some money to start your escrow account, and they want a little bit of cushion in case those bills go up next year. They still want to be able to pay them on your behalf.
Okay, because I know that you had mentioned that when we give the earnest money, that goes into an escrow.
It's a
Right.
different escrow account. This is the escrow account that's holding your taxes and your insurance that the lender is set up for you. So when those bills come due, they're taking the money from your escrow account and paying those bills on your behalf. Earnest money doesn't, earnest money goes with the attorney or the firm. This is with the lender. The lender doesn't hold the earnest money. They need somewhere to put the 12th of your taxes each month you send it in. They need somewhere to put a 12th of your insurance each month that you send it in. So the lender will originate, they'll set up an escrow account for you. It's just a place to hold that money until those bills are due. The other last little piece of math we have before we get to do a settlement statement problem, we're getting there. Y'all getting excited? You should be. The other little, no, come on. The other little piece of math to discuss is something called interim interest. Interim interest is going to show up as a debit to the buyer. Interim interest is what the lender charges the buyer for interest. We do not prorate interim interest. This is a charge between the buyer and their lender. With interim interest, I like a picture. So let's go to closing today. Remember we said the other day when we were amortizing and we were doing problems that in units 14 and 15 that interest is paid in arrears. So we said when you made your mortgage payment on February 1st, you were paying January's interest. When you make your mortgage payment on March 1st, you're paying February's interest. Where's your rear? Your rear is, and I got you guys looking at your butts at PSI Testing Center. So your rear is behind you. Interest is paid in arrears. Whenever a buyer originates a new loan, they do not have a mortgage payment the first month. They always get to skip the first. So if we go to closing today, there is no payment due on March 1st. We go to closing today, they skip the first, and that means your buyer's first mortgage payment is going to be April 1st. They always skip the first. Draw your timeline, see the first, and know we can skip that. When they make their first payment on April 1st, they're paying March's interest. Interest is paid in arrears. Why don't they have a payment on March 1st? Because they don't have a full month's interest to pay, right? You'd be overcharging your buyer for an extra 13 days that they didn't even own the property for. So they skip the first. Tell your buyer they get the first month off. They want to hear that. I mean, they just bought a house, So they get their first month off. Their first mortgage payment is due on April 1st, and that covers March's interest. Do I have everybody so far? Questions so far? Y'all put your lender back hat. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
why aren't they prorating from the 14th to the March 1st?
Who are they going to prorate with?
because you go by the day that they owe you that interest.
But who is the buyer prorating with? The seller's not involved with this, are they? This is a charge directly from the lender to the buyer. The seller has absolutely nothing to do in that relationship. So the lender, y'all put your lender hat back on for a second. Put it back on for a second. You know you're going to collect interest in March when you get that payment in April, right? Is your lender hat on, and are you asking yourself, well, what the heck am I going to get paid for the rest of February? And through the eyes of the lender, that lender hat says that interim interest is always the day of closing to the last day of that month. Never, ever go into the next month. Interim interest is always, y'all hear my absolute word? Interim interest is always the day of settlement to the last day of that month. Is your lender hat on? Do you want to collect interest on February 14th? Heck yeah, aren't you in the business of making money? How are you going to originate a loan today and not make any money today? So we're going to charge, the lender is going to charge the buyer for the day of closing through the end of the month. That gets the borrower caught up on their interest payment. The lender's happy because they have, and again, we're going to count that on our fingers if we wanted to do that, which we will. Interim interest is always the day of closing to the last day of that month. That gets the lender caught up. Questions on the days before we figure out how much? So now we got to figure out how much. Y'all remember this formula when we were amortizing? The balance times the interest rate gave us annual interest. And when we were amortizing, we took that annual interest and divided by 12, right? We had to break it down to monthly. When we're doing interim interest, we take that annual interest and divide it by 360 to break it down to daily interest. So the balance times the interest rate gives us annual interest. Divide it by 360 because we're in pre-licensing world. And that gives us daily interest. Now we can take the amount of the daily interest times it by the number of days that we came up with when we counted on our fingers. That will show up as a debit to the buyer at settlement. That's a lender charge. Now the lender is caught up on their interest payments. The lender has received their money. No payment on March 1st. First payment will be April 1st. Interest is paid in arrears. Questions on interim interest? Never go into the next month. You double charged your buyer. Do you have a happy buyer if you double charge them? Questions? Can I erase the red? So let's bring this home. What in the world does all this mean to us? Well, this is why we're here. We need a thorough understanding of these settlement statements. Again, we're just introducing you to it. We're just kind of easing you in, throw you into the full-blown thing in post-licensing. As we've already discussed, the commission says we have a duty to verify the numbers in which we have actual knowledge. If it has passed my desk or my email, I need to verify that number. I need to verify that it's right. And as with anything else, we need to look out for red flags. You know, like I said earlier, I wasn't privy to the conversation between the buyer and the lender. I was not there when the lender said, these are my fees. This is how much I'm going to charge you. So I don't know those exact amounts. I cannot verify them, but I do need to be on the lookout for red flags. Like I said, usually we're looking at 1% loan origination fee, 1.5%, maybe a 2.5%. If I saw a 12% loan origination fee, my little red flag would go up, and it would cause me to call the lender, call the buyer, call the lender, and ask some questions and make sure that that's right. So I can't verify everything. I can look at the whole thing. I can review the whole thing and test it for accuracy. So always on the lookout for red flags. As we said, what can we verify? And this isn't in your book. This is straight from the syllabus. Because we know 561 and 562, we know what things are typically debits and credits to our parties. We know if our parties agree otherwise, right? Because we're there forming the contract. So we know if they agree to do something otherwise. 561 and 562 gives us things that are typically debits and credits. One of the best things we can do to verify is pull out the contract. Make sure the agreed upon purchase price is right. The agreed upon due diligence, earnest money. Was there additional earnest money? Did we renegotiate anything? Do I have an amendment to the contract? Prorating, we can pick up the calculator and do interim interest, excise tax. We can just straight up add. We can add the figures and make sure that A plus B equals C. And then if we have any unpaid invoices, so if any of our buyers, due diligence providers, the home inspector, for example, allows the buyer to pay for the home inspection at closing, they're probably going to send you and the buyer the invoice. They're going to send the buyer the invoice for their records, but they're also going to send you the invoice so you can forward it on to the closing attorney to make sure that the closing attorney adds it as a debit to the settlement statement. Anything that's touched my desk, I can see, I can make sure that that home inspector fee, for example, is showing up, the correct amount is showing up as a debit to the buyer. So we're looking these things over. When I get these things from the attorney the day before closing, 2 days before closing, I grab my contract and I grab my calculator, making sure that if nothing else, things just add. Do I find mistakes? I don't know if you guys have noticed, but I don't say if you find a mistake, I say when you find a mistake. Guys, humans prepare these things. And the more sets of eyes we have on them, the better chance for accuracy that we have. When you find a mistake, we have a duty to report it. This is all about Old Car. If you see an incorrect number, an incorrect calculation, you see a fee in a wrong place, something that should be a debit is a credit. I know y'all are going to call somebody if your commission's wrong. I know you will call somebody in the drop of a hat. We need to call somebody if any figure is wrong. So when you find an error, either call the attorney or call the lender. At this point, when you and I see the closing disclosures, we're like the day of, the day before settlement. And the attorney and the lender are working together to put the finishing touches on things, to make this final thing happen. So at this point, one knows what the other is doing. Everybody's involved. We're all together, getting ready for tomorrow or Thursday. Questions?
You're doing that 3 days before though, right?
The lender sends it to the buyer 3 days before. You and I don't get it until like the day before. That's one piece of communication that I can't get involved in. So the lender is not allowed to send it to me and say, forward this on to your buyer. So that 3 days, and thank you, Carrie, that's a great question. That 3 days before is the lender sending it to the buyer. Once the buyer approves it, at some point after that is when you and I get it to review it. Once I review it and I'm good, or I've requested any changes, I'm the one that gets to tell my buyer how much to get from the bank. How much do they need to bring to closing to the penny? So we're going to tell our buyer, I need readily available funds. We can't have a buyer bringing a personal check. Nobody wants to delay settlement and closing that period, like what, 10 business days waiting on the thing to clear. So we need readily available funds. We either need a cashier's check or a wire transfer. Which one? It may depend on the attorney. The lender tells the buyer when they send that CD 3 days, they say, don't go to the bank until you've talked to your agent. So once I review it, my numbers are good. I make sure I'm good. I'm the one that says to my buyer, go to the bank and get X amount. I'll see you at the house tomorrow morning for the final walkthrough. And we are on our way to settlement. Is this exciting? I still get excited when I talk about this. I think if I ever stop getting excited, it's time for me to retire from real estate. So not yet. I still get giddy when I talk about closing. Questions? I know it's break time. Please bear with me real quick. We're going to wrap up on the PowerPoints. When we come back from break, we'll be done with PowerPoint. So to wrap up 21 on the PowerPoints, your key point review, I'm sorry, your terms, here we go. Your terms are back at the beginning on page 517. Your key point review is on page 563. Your student quiz is on 565. You do have some sample, how much does the buyer have to bring to closing? You may even see how much is the seller going to get. Again, it's all just good practice. If you can do the sellers and do the buyers, you'll be good. And you're positioning yourself, getting ready for post-licensing. So practice, practice, practice. And then those 50 problems in the back of the book, where there's the math concepts that we already saw in our summary page. And then those 50 problems in the back of the book, these are the numbers that relate to what we just did. This is not only good practice with how much does the buyer have to bring to closing, but this is stuff like interim interest, prorating problems. By the way, you guys, you're going to see how much does the buyer have to bring to closing. But you may also see a standalone proration problem. You may also see a standalone interim interest problem. So learning this math could get you more than one test question. Questions? All right, let's take 10. We come back, we're going to do a settlement, a mini CD. We back? By the way, I wanted to share with you guys my sob story. Back in the day when I took pre-licensing, we had to do a full-blown settlement statement. This was 4 questions on my exam. I don't want to hear a single one of you complain about a mini CD. Okay? Full-blown settlement statement and pre-licensing. Are you guys glad they changed that? But then they moved it to post. So don't worry, you don't get away from it. All right, cameras are back, or we're on, that cameras are back. I'm going to take attendance. And we're going to look first at where we are. So if you look, when you look in the online learning system, the Unit 21 material has some sample closing disclosures. The one we're going to work in class together is mini CD1. So we're going to work this one together. You guys have it. You also have the answer key. So if you want to go back later, of course, you have the recording, but you also have this information in front of you. For practice, there's mini CD2, mini CD4, and mini CD5, all with the answer keys. So we're going to do one in class together. If we have time at the end, we'll try to do another one. But for right now, we're going to do one. Plus, you guys have your book. Plus, remember that math workbook that we introduced you guys to last week? That's got some extra problems in there as well. Where is CD number 3? You might be asking yourself. I think CD number 3 is a lot harder than what you're ever going to see on your exam. So I chose not to include it. If you're up for the challenge, just reach out to me after side of class and I'm happy to send it to you. But I just think it's a lot harder, more difficult than what you're ever going to see on the test. So I didn't put it in. So we got practice. We got one here, some in the book, some in that math workbook. Again, it all goes back to pages 561 and 562, knowing what's a debit to whom and what's a credit to whom. So here's our closing fact situation. And what we're going to do, because you won't have this on your test, but you will have a blank scratch piece of paper, both my exam and the state exam. So you'll have blank paper. We'll talk more about that. And what we're going to do, though, is take this problem. We're going to divide it into 2 categories. We're going to go through this problem and identify the things that are the credits to the buyer and the things that are the debits to the buyer. So then we can add them up and figure out how much does the buyer have to bring to closing. So our problem is here. We're going to try to get it to where we can see it. And I'm going to set myself up with a little whiteboard. Can you guys see that okay? Maybe good enough. Can you guys see all that okay? These things are broken down. They're either going to be bullet points, which is something similar to what we're looking at here, or they're just going to be one big run-on paragraph. You have practice with both in the online learning system, in your book, and the math workbook. With these, you're always going to start at the top and work your way through. Do not get out of order. Don't start skipping around, because as soon as you skip around, you skip something. So when you see these problems, start at the top and you work your way down to the bottom. So the first thing we're going to do is take our blank scratch piece of paper. I need to give myself a little bit more room here. Take your blank paper, draw a line down the middle of it. And on one side, we're going to identify all of the buyer's credits. And on the other side, we're going to identify all of the buyer's debits. Is it IT or T? D-E-B, IT? I do math, I don't spell. I can't do good at both. I just can't. Thank God for spell check, right? All right. I know I preach about reading the whole problem before you start. These are kind of hard to do because they are very lengthy. But if I skip ahead, our focal point on this question, what do we care about? Bottom line, we're solving, how much does the buyer have to bring to closing? When you call the buyer and say your cashier's check or your money order needs to be X amount. This is what we're solving here. So I do usually encourage you guys, oh no, to read the whole problem. But in these cases, I suggest skipping to the end and seeing how much in cash does the buyer have to bring to closing. So you know that's your focal point as you work your way through the problem. I mean, you can take the time to read the whole thing, but you're just taking time. Because with these, we got to dissect them and break them down and look at every little thing anyway. So our focus is on the buyer. What in this case, what in this problem do I care about the seller? Do I care about the seller? Nah, because what's the problem asking me? How much does the buyer? That's why we need that focal point. That's why we need to know what we're talking about. So start at the top and work our way down. And I can see mouths move. Buyer enters into a purchase contract with the seller to buy the seller's house for $210,750. Stop. Is the sales price going to be a debit or a credit to the buyer? And I can see your mouths move. Is the sales price going to be a debit or a credit to the buyer? It's going to be a debit. Isn't that money that they owe? And who do they owe that money to? The seller. Our 16-page contract says, I will give you $210,750 in exchange for your property. So the sales price will always be a debit to the buyer. When I'm doing these, I like to label my numbers so I know what that is. And if I have to go back and revisit this, it could save me some test time and trying to figure out what that number is. So I do, that's just a preference thing. I do label my numbers. Then it goes on to say, the purchase contract provides for a November 24th settlement. I like to write the settlement date on the top of my page somewhere so I can have it as a quick reference. I know I'm going to need it for several things. And so again, it could save me some precious test time instead of going back through the problem and hunting around and trying to find it. If I have the settlement statement or the date right here in front of me, I know I can use that. Then it says the seller has paid taxes prior to closing. Oops, and will be prorated at settlement using the 360-day method of $2,610. I saw the word prorate and I said, I need to see my picture. I need to draw my timeline. I know what I'm prorating is annual taxes. So my timeline is for the year. What divides this year is the day of settlement. The seller owns the property the front part of the year. The buyer owns the property the latter part of the year. First thing I want you to do, once you draw your timeline and you see your visual, stop and ask yourself, who owes who? If the seller has paid taxes for the entire year, seller's already paid, we need to determine who owes who, because that helps us decide what side of the timeline we're looking at. So I'm seeing mouths move, and I'm learning how to read lips quickly in Zoom, by the way. And what I'm hearing you guys say is that the buyer owes the seller. And the buyer owes the seller for the period of time that they own the property. So on the settlement statement, this one is going to shake out as a debit to the buyer, credit to the seller. Let me move this up here so we can see it. The buyer owes for the day after settlement through the end of the year. The buyer is reimbursing the seller. The seller's already paid the year's taxes. And now they're looking at the buyer going, you owe me some money because I didn't own this property the whole year. Do I have everybody? The buyer owes the seller, and what they owe is for the period of time that they own the property. So how long does the buyer owe? Y'all got your fingers ready? They owe for the 25th, 26th, 27, 28, 29, and 30. There are 6 days left in November, plus 30 days in December. And without a calculator, I think that is 36 days. Please do not look at November and see 5 days. So easy to do, and you've missed the whole dang problem. Not because you don't know what you're doing. I know y'all know what you're doing, but because you got in a hurry, you got careless, and you didn't count it out on your fingers. So take the time to count it out to get that number right. Everybody with me? This is the voice of experience speaking. Questions on how I got the 36 days?
Yeah, where did the 30 days come from?
December, the month of December. So we had 6 days left in November, plus 30 days in December. So now we need to figure out how much. I know annual, I can't see it. I know annual taxes are 2610. We need to break it down to daily. So when I take my annual and I divide by 360, need even more room. I'm going to go up. I'm going to go down here. So when I take my annual taxes at 2610 and I divide it by 360, I get daily taxes of $7.25. What I'm telling you is every single day this year, taxes are $7.25. How much are taxes today? $7.25. How much were they yesterday? $7.25. We took the annual taxes, we divided by 360 to break it down to $7.25. Now we just take that times the number of days that the buyer owes the seller. And we see that the buyer owes the seller, we've already determined it's a debit. The buyer owes the seller for their share of taxes of $261. And this is our prorated taxes, our real property taxes, prorated. Debit the buyer $261. That's the money that they owe the seller. That makes it fair. In pre-licensing world, every month has 30 days. Every year has 360. I know how to spell prorate. That's just a typo. I feel the need to say that. I do know how to spell prorate some days. Questions? Questions on how we got the 261? Questions on why we debited the buyer $261? Can I erase the red prorated math? I'll keep the credit debit, but can I erase the prorated math? Okay. Continuing on. Next up, it says debits and credits for the following items should be made to common practice. When you see common practice, that's referring to pages 561 and 562. That's what we learned for 561 and 562 are typical charges, common practice, and we always do what the problem tells us. So looking at your mouse move, we have an earnest money deposit of $4,500. Is that going to be a debit or a credit to the buyer? Earnest money deposit, credit or debit to the buyer? And I'm seeing mouse move and I'm seeing credit. They paid that money once when we went under contract, didn't they? And we told them when we went under contract, if you pay this money, it will be credited back to you at settlement. So now we're just honoring what we told them. Then we got financing. This problem tells me the loan amount. The problem may not tell you the loan amount. We may have to use our loan to value ratio to find the loan amount. So it'll tell you the value, it'll give you the ratio, and then we multiply, find the loan amount. This case, it tells you, I got a $175,000 new conventional 30-year mortgage loan. Is the loan amount a debit or a credit to the buyer? And I'm trying to read lips as best as I can. The loan amount is going to be a credit to the buyer. The lender is bringing this money on their behalf on the day of settlement. Can the buyer close without this $175,000? If the lender just disappears and they never show up at settlement, the buyer can't close without the lender, can they? The lender is actually bringing this money on the buyer's behalf. The buyer will spend the next 30 years paying them back for this money that they bring today. So the loan amount will be a credit today, the day of closing. We got our interest rate of 7.5%. We got a 1% loan origination fee and 2 discount points to be paid by the borrower. So we know the loan amount. Now we got to figure out the loan origination fee and the discount points. Remember, loan origination fee and discount points are always of the loan amount. What does the lender care about? Does the lender care about the purchase price? No, they care about their money. So we have our loan amount of $175,000. Oops. I got a 1% loan origination fee for $1,750. So that's our 1% loan origination fee. And then we also have 2 discount points. Discount points are also the loan amount. And remember discount points. The number of discount points tells you the percentage of the loan. So 2 discount points is going to shake out to what percentage of the loan? 2. So we take the loan amount. Now we're going to times it by 2%. And we have discount points. Let's see. So this is our loan origination fee. These are our discount points. Both are going to be a charge or a debit to the buyer. Loan origination fee, and then $3,500 for discount points. All lender charges will be a debit to the buyer.
So could we have done 3% there?
Sure. If you can see that, save yourself a step. You're going to get up with the same amount. Absolutely. Remember what I said. I don't care how you get the right answer. So if you see it a different way, as long as you get what I got, we're good. Questions on loan origination fee or discount points? Next, we have interim interest through November 30th on the borrower's new mortgage loan. Let's see how we're doing. Why don't you guys tell me in a private chat, if we're going to go to closing on November 24th, when is the borrower's first mortgage payment going to be? If we go to closing on November 24th, when is their first mortgage payment going to be due? So we go to closing on November 24th. We do not have a payment the first. We always skip the first. So the first mortgage payment is going to be due. Haha, Happy New Year. Their first mortgage payment is going to be due the first of the year. And when they make that payment on the first of the year, they're paying December's interest. That's why we can't charge them a payment December, because they didn't have the loan out for the entire month of November. So we go to closing on the 21st, 24th. First payment is due January 1st. Because we are not prorating, this is between the buyer and their lender, we're going to count the day of closing. So interim interest will be from the day of closing. Interim interest is always from the day of closing to the last day of that month. And now to figure out how many days you got: the 24th, the 25th, the 26th, 27th, 28th, 29th, and the 30th. So the buyer owes their lender for 7 days of interim interest. You do count closing day for interim interest. So we counted the 24th, 25th, 26th, 27th, 28th, 29th, and 30th. So now we need to figure out how much. The lender's happy to get 7 days, but now they want to know how much. So to find that, we take the balance, which on the day of settlement, our balance is our loan amount. All charges to the lender are of the loan amount. So we have our balance, $175,000, times our interest rate, which the problem told us right here. That gives me annual interest. I need to take annual interest and break it down to daily. That's right. So daily interest, I took my balance times my interest rate. That gave me annual interest. Then I divide annual interest by 360 to get daily interest, $36.46. Questions so far before we do the last step? How did I get to 7 days? How did I get to $36.46? So in the last step is to take our daily interest times the number of days, which gives me a debit to the buyer of $255.22 for interim interest. This is what they owe their lender to get caught up on their interest payment. We've talked about rounding a little bit. Actually, when you take 13,125 divided by 360, you get like this big long number. If, best bet is just not clear your calculator, right? And then you can say times by 7, and that's when you round, when you get to the final number. If you do want to round, again, the recommendation is that you go out at least 3 decimal places. But guys, please listen to me. You're not going to miss a question by rounding alone. So in other words, if you came up with 24 cents, you're not going to have those 2 answer choices. They're not going to be, so you're going to be able to look at that and go, well, that's close enough. I know that's what they mean. Does that make sense? I'd almost be willing to guarantee, if I were a betting woman, I'd almost be willing to guarantee that they will have an answer choice that's $36.46 off, banking on you not counting your days right. So don't let them win. Count those days out.
Julie?
Yeah.
I have a question.
Sure.
So the 7 days, you're counting November 24th, which is the day of closing.
Mm-hmm.
So the interest, the day of closing is the buyer's responsibility.
Correct.
Although the day of closing is the tax's responsibility. I mean, the seller will be responsible as far as the taxes on the day of closing. In this case, the buyer is responsible for the interest the day of closing.
When we prorate, the seller's responsible because it's only those prorated things. What do we say we prorate? Taxes, HOA, and rent. Those are the
Gotcha.
shared expenses between the buyer and the seller.
Okay.
Who is it between with the interest? Who is that relationship between? That's between the buyer and who?
And the lender.
Lender. Has absolutely nothing to do with the seller. Put yourself in the seller's shoes. Do you want to pay somebody else's interest? No. So the idea that the seller is responsible for the day of closing only applies when we're prorating. Calculating interim interest is not prorating. The $17.50 is my 1% loan origination fee. So I took the loan origination fee times, or the loan times it by 1%. The $3,500 is 2% times the loan amount. So we took the 175,000 times 1% to get the 1750. Then we took the loan amount of 175,000 times 2%, 2 discount points, and got 3,500. Other questions so far? This is your time.
Julie?
Yeah.
I have one question. You said the first mortgage payments would be due on what date?
It's going to be due January 1st. We skipped the first.
Okay.
So happy New Year.
Mhm.
You get to bring in the year with a
Mhm.
mortgage payment. It'll be due
Okay,
January
thank you.
1st.
So because you're using separate itemized things here, we can't do a 10.5% on that sentence there. Is your
10.5%.
financing for your loan?
Mhm.
Oh, so the other one's not an annual rate. Okay, sorry.
I'm not seeing.
The numbers that I'm seeing is 7.5%, then I'm seeing 1%, and then 2 discounts, which is another 2. So if you add that up, it's 10.5%.
Yeah, but that 7.5% is your interest rate. The only time we need the interest rate and settlement statement math is to do interim interest. We need that interest rate balance times the interest rate. Anything else so far? It's a good checkpoint. I'm erasing everything but credit and debit columns. Unless somebody speaks up and says otherwise, real quick. Everybody good?
I didn't see you calculate the down payment.
Well, that's a great question, Tom. And we did without doing it. By putting in the sales price, let's just pretend for a second that there was only two things that mattered for the buyer at closing. There's the sales price as a debit, and then there's the loan amount of $175,000. And what we're going to learn when we get to the end, we're going to add up all the credits and we're going to add up all the debits. And the difference between the two is going to be what your buyer has to bring to closing. So when we're not actually putting the buyer's down payment in here, it shakes out. Because if there were no other charges, when we take the purchase price minus the loan amount, what we have left is the buyer's down payment.
All right, it's methodology, because I just did it in a linear fashion. I wasn't doing two columns.
And if please, if you want to do it that way, absolutely. So again, just to kind of recap, the down payment is already figured in when comparing the loan amount to the purchase price. It's the difference that the buyer is going to have to bring. Now, back to reality, real world and pre-licensing world. The buyer has a lot more expenses and credits than just the purchase price and the sales price, right? And that's why we're looking at all of their numbers, because they're going to have to bring more than that down payment. There's more involved as we're learning. So we've done interim interest. Now we got private mortgage insurance. I don't even need the problem to know that this is a conventional loan with a loan to value ratio of 80% or more. Why do I know that? Because the lender's charging PMI. And they're only going to charge PMI on a conventional loan when the loan to value ratio is 80% or higher. Either they're going to give you the number or they're going to give you how to calculate it. In this case, they're going to give you how to calculate. And this lender is going to collect it at closing for the first year. And they're going to charge PMI of 0.4% of the loan amount. What do we say the word of means in a math problem? Of means multiply. So we take our loan amount times 0.40%. That point is very important. So 175,000 times 0.40% gives us PMI, that's a lender charge, of $700. Again, the problem is going to tell you PMI is this amount, $700 in this case. Or they're going to tell you how to find it. This one told you how to find it. 0.4% of the loan amount. Then we have buyer's homeowner's insurance annual premium, $444 to be paid at closing. Let's talk about insurance for a second. Insurance is always paid in advance. So when any insurance, homeowner's insurance, medical insurance, car insurance, when you make your insurance payment, you're paying for coverage in advance. Yes? If you make your health insurance payment today or the first of the month, they're covering you for the month. If you make your car insurance payment today, they're covering you for the next 6 months. The buyer's got to pay for the first year of homeowners insurance at closing, so they're covered for the first year. It's how insurance works. So there's always going to be a charge to the buyer for the first year of homeowners insurance. The attorney will send this directly to State Farm or Geico or Allstate or whoever the buyer has decided to use for their homeowners insurance. So they're going to collect that money on behalf of the buyer as settlement. And then they will send that in on the buyer's behalf to cover their first year, their first annual premium. Due diligence fee of $250, credit or debit to the buyer. Due diligence fee is going to be a credit. They paid that money once. So now that we're at settlement, we need to reverse that. And again, didn't we tell them that when we went under contract? Your due diligence fee and your earnest money will be credited back to you at closing. Buyer hires the attorney. So the buyer gets to pay the attorney's fee of $450. Title insurance is the buyer's coverage once that deed changes hands. Title insurance covers the owner for errors of the past. So it's going to be a one-time fee. This problem put lender and owner's coverage together. Some problems will break it down. This is the buyer's title insurance, the owner's title insurance, and this is the lender's. They're both going to be a debit to the buyer, no matter how they word that. So the buyer gets to pay for both policies for title insurance. They're not credited as being, well, they are. They're being put towards the sales price because, again, the sales price is on the debit side and the due diligence and the earnest money are on the credit side. So what we're doing is, like I said, when we get to the end, we're going to add up all the credits. We're going to add up all the difference, the debits, and then the difference of the two is going to tell us what your buyer has to bring. Does that answer? Yep, perfect. So title insurance of $475. Deed preparation fee of $65. What am I going to do with the deed preparation fee? What am I going to do with the deed? Why don't you guys tell me in a private chat? Let's see what I see. I see you guys. What are we going to do with the deed preparation fee? There we go. There we go. There we go. Love it. Best response ever. Nothing, not your problem. Who pays to have the deed prepared? The seller. There's your distraction. This is why we need to know the things that are debits to the seller, because they like to do this to you. They like to throw you those numbers going, oh no, that's a debit to the buyer. Again, you can't miss a problem by rounding, but I can almost guarantee you one of these answer choices is off by $65, banking on you trying to do something with it. Not your problem. 561 and 562. No. No. When the seller pays that deed preparation fee, that's going to the attorney to prepare their deed. They're not going to pay the buyer to do that. So deed preparation fee, tricky. See what they like to do? How do we not let the distractors win? 561 and 562. Anybody tried sleeping with your book under your pillow yet? Learning by osmosis? What the heck, you know? What can it hurt, right? Just be careful you don't hurt yourself with it in the middle of that night. That thing could do some damage. My goodness. So the deed preparation fee is the responsibility of the seller. It does not belong on the buyer's mini closing disclosure. However, the deed recording fee does belong on the buyer's. The buyer gets to pay to have the deed recorded. So there's a $15 deed recording fee. Survey of $300. Survey is part of the buyer's due diligence. So unless agreed otherwise, unless we're told otherwise, the buyer pays all the costs of their due diligence, inspections, in this case, survey. And then there's usually some kind of, I call it the nickel and dime fee, right? Like some kind of courier fee or wire transfer fee or some kind of opportunity, just give one more little fee out of you. So in this case, there's a $25 courier fee to the buyer. Questions so far? It's a lot to take in. I get it. Remember what I said before this started? Not a single one of you is leaving this call tonight as an expert in doing closing disclosure math. But we're getting the gist of what's happening, right? We're going through the problems. We're identifying the things that are the credit to the buyer, the things that are the debit to the buyer, and we're adding them all up. The last piece of this is dealing with loan escrows. The lender wants to collect, remember, to originate your escrow account, to fund it, and then to collect a little bit of cushion. The lender wants to collect some money at settlement to fund the escrow account. So in addition to paying this year's taxes, and in addition to paying this year's homeowner's insurance, we're also going to do some additional monies into the loan escrow for your taxes and insurance. So again, the problem has to tell you what the lender wants to collect. In this case, they're going to take 4 months of real property taxes and 2 months of homeowners insurance. So with both of these, we're going to have to go back up into the problem a little bit and be reminded that my annual taxes are $2,610. My annual homeowner's insurance is $444. I'm going to stop here for tonight. I think this is math we can do tomorrow. We can finish this. I'm going to take a screenshot so we literally can pick back up right here tomorrow. If you want to figure out the 4 months of taxes and the 2 months of homeowner's insurance, we have the full amount, right? We have the annual amounts. The first thing you need to do is take annual and divide by 12 to get monthly. Once you have monthly, then you just times it by the number of months. So if it's 4 months, you take the monthly times 4. If it's 2 months, you take the monthly times 2. Again, I'm going to start here tomorrow. So if you guys want to finish this, you can. Once you finish that loan escrow, add up all your credits, add up all your debits, but will finish this in class tomorrow. So hang on, don't go anywhere. Let me take a screenshot real quick so I don't have to recreate the wheel tomorrow. Let's see, question comes in. Do you have cram courses coming up? Yes, you do. So under our Campbell folder, you guys have your night schedule. There's a cram course on February 25th. There's a cram course on March 2nd. You guys are going to want to come to the one on the 25th because your exam is when? March 2nd. So come to the one on the 25th. We'll get you ready for your exam on the 2nd. You're welcome to come to the one on the 4th if you need to take the retake, for example. If you just want the knowledge, you're welcome to come to the one on the 4th. But the one for you guys is February 25th.
Julie, can I ask a question about the retake? Is the retake actually like you've taken the exam before, then you're taking it again, or does it mean that you missed the first one?
It mean in order to be eligible for the retake, you have to at least make a 50% on the exam on March 2nd. You have to at least make a 50% to be eligible for the retake.
Okay. Thank you.
Of course. All right, guys, so we will finish this closing disclosure tomorrow night, pick up where we left off. We'll wrap it up. We're really close to being done. So we'll try to do a quick recap to get caught up. We'll finish it up and then we'll be done. After that, we move on to unit 17. So we keep going. After 17, we do 13. Probably won't get through 13 tomorrow night. But again, if you're looking ahead, unit 17 is coming tomorrow. 13 won't take us but 30 minutes to get through. Short, sweet unit, sweet to the point. That's what I know for today. You guys have a great night. See you tomorrow, same place, same time. Happy Valentine's Day, by the way. Go spend the rest of the evening with your sweetie. Thank you.